everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Sam Silver. I'm the chair of the BCS Law SG. Thank you for joining our webinar this evening. We've got a very exciting session, we think, and we've got a great lineup of speakers. I guess unless you were hiding underneath a rock or not reading any news, you probably have heard of ChatGPT. It's probably all around. And this session is just really talking about how this sort of phenomena, or I guess trend, has sort of, I guess, immersed into our sort of society and our lives. And, you know, it's raising a number of questions in terms of, you know, future of law, the education of law, and this session will be sort of aimed at exploring those. And I said, we've got a great line of speakers. I will let them introduce themselves, but first I'll just name who they are. So that we've got Tara Basaran, who is one of the BCS Law SG committee members. So we're very pleased that she's going to be here. We've got Richard South, who is a lecturer at the University of Derby, and we've got Rebecca Harold, who's a CEO of a startup SaaS company doing AI. But they will go into more details about what their backgrounds and their areas of expertise. But I will leave it up to Tara to take it. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Sam. Thank you all our attendees. Very great to have everyone here. We're going to speak about ChatGPT. We will extend that into more general LLMs and the impact that they could have on the educational system and the law. I have the pleasure of having between my guests Rebecca and Richard from each side of the pond. I'm myself, as you mentioned, a member of the BCS Law Specialist Committee. I'm French, and I have a background of corporate law. I have specialized in IT and intellectual property law in the UK, and I have a great interest on anything that interests the internet and its regulation. It goes from privacy data protection to copyright and other stuff. I was very much interested on what the ChatGPT is doing because everyone is talking about, and it's a big hype. So as always, I quite like to dismantle the whole machinery and see what's behind the scene. You might have heard, and you're hearing my accent. This is why I've mentioned that I'm French, and I live in the UK. And tonight I have decided to invite our Rebecca Harold from the US with the American accent, and Richard Self from the University of Derby with the British accent. It's not just for the fun that I'm mentioning that, it's just because probably Rebecca and Richard would tell you that they don't speak the same language. For me, it was quite hard. It took me a while before I could distinguish between the English and the US English. Not only the accents are different, but also some of the words are different. To make it a bit more complex, I actually got two half Australian children who went to an American school in the UK.
What?
Oh. And they like a Korean teacher. That shows you all the cultural world we live in and the interconnected global world we are in. ChatGPT is supposed to be a machine that would give an answer to everyone wherever they are. Currently, there are only few languages that are integrated, but its majority is US culture. So if you have time, I will touch about this issue of culture and these tools. It's a language model. Some people have taken it as a search engine or any tool to answer questions. We've played around. I think the three of us, we have played funny games with ChatGPT, and we have some really great surprises. I'm going to give the floor to Rebecca. She's going to introduce herself. Rebecca and I know each other for a while. It's been probably a bit more than a decade. We are both very active on anything IT and data protection. So the floor is yours, Rebecca.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here today. So I'm Rebecca Harold, based out of Des Moines, Iowa. I'm CEO of the Privacy Professor Consultancy, and I founded that in 2004, and CEO of Privacy and Security Brainiac SaaS Services. And I've been building that with one of my sons since 2021. So I love working with him. I have more than 30 years of IT, information security, and privacy experience. I started my corporate career as a systems engineer, and I actually built the change control system for a large multinational Fortune 200 financial and health insurance organization. And after I built that and supported it for a while, I went into IT audit, and I performed the very first there systems and data security audit. And as a result of that audit, why I was asked to build the information protection program, which I recommended that they create. So I am very thankful for the opportunity to start building their first, or having built their first security and privacy programs starting in the early 1990s. And while I was doing that, I created their first security and privacy standards, policies, and procedures, their security and privacy training, and I performed their first risk assessments and performed their first other types of assessments. And if you think about it, in 1992, there weren't any laws and regulations to speak of governing things. We were on a mainframe, my goodness. We weren't even connected to anything like the internet at that point in time. But as we started getting connected to remote locations throughout the 1990s, there became a need to create remote access solutions. And so that was my responsibility to create a secure remote access. So I created their first secure remote access solution. We started seeing problems with malware very early on. And at that point in time, the malware was not so focused as we are today on personal data. The malware was focused on having denial of service to your IT systems and to availability of programs and applications. And very importantly, back at that point in time, it was about the protection of intellectual property and not having competitors or others from getting access to it and sharing it. So, I've been providing a wide range of first with new and emerging technologies throughout my entire career, which has taught me a lot of lessons early on that I'm still using today. So it's something that I've been implementing and using within the healthcare space very deeply, within government, financial, and technology industries. I've been working with a lot of startups and technology companies for the past 23 years since I've been doing consulting. I've actually done work for NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, on several projects since 2009, and I've co-authored over a dozen of their informative references and standards for the smart grid, for the privacy framework, for the IoT products, and I've actually performed proof of concept projects to actually test if the standards that say they're keeping things secure and private actually work that way in real life. And I love doing that because I love looking for the weak spots, the vulnerabilities in algorithms and systems and non-technical processes. I'm also an expert witness. I've been an expert witness for several cases. I've done them for a couple of cases that involved people who were targeting victims using IoT devices, and they used them to track them down. And in each case, their victim became a physical victim. They were horribly assaulted. So I looked into how those IoT devices were used to track them down and where the security problems were at. I've looked at how the personal data within a gated community of wealthy retired citizens who have, very nice homes and a lot of valuables, how their personal data was taken and sold to a lot of third parties, a lot of HIPAA compliance cases, and also metapixel tracking cases. And interestingly enough, I've also been testified as an eyewitness for the FBI and Department of Justice against an organized crime ring who were committing nationwide mortgage fraud. So that was a very interesting case. I was an adjunct professor at the Norwich University Master of Science and Information Security Assurance program for 9.5 years. And I've written a lot of books, 22 so far, about these various topics. So I guess to sum it up, I love new technologies. I love the possibilities that they bring, but I think we all need to, instead of jumping on the new technology bandwagon right away, we need to ensure that they are secure, because the higher the level of potential of benefit that technology has, I found over the years, you have that same height of risk involved, especially when new technologies do not have security and privacy controls engineered into them. We need to do that more. So I'll stop preaching there, Tara. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion today.
Having been slightly involved with your work with NIST on IoT and security, I think most of us were emphasizing the need that any new project would have in view the security issues, the privacy by design, and the ethics. Unfortunately, it's not always the case. The product is launched and you work with startup. Usually privacy by design is not what they have in mind at first. It's mostly going in to find a budget. We see budget and investment, huge investment going to some products. They go up and they go into a completely different direction. Talking initially about these ChatGPT, could you tell us more about what are the security holes that you have already noticed?
Well, you know, I've done a lot of research, but I have so much more to do. So what I've been starting out is I like to start out just with, first of all, I'm looking at privacy initially. And I'm thinking, okay, if this is spitting out what people are taking blindly as being factual information, I'm thinking, what are the sources that it is using in order to spit out all of this, these results, right? So I started looking at it, and it's very worrisome to me to see that what appears to be about 60% of the source of information is from Common Crawl. And basically Common Crawl has been scraping data from online sites since about 2008. And that worries me from a privacy standpoint for many reasons, but also from a legal standpoint, because if there's a personal data in there, and I'll come back to that, those folks didn't give their consent to have their data used to train an artificial intelligence type of tool, such as, you know, the ChatGPT. So anyway, that was something where most of that data is coming from there. So I started thinking, well, if I go into Common Crawl, is there a way that I can actually see what is in there? There's a tool that's called Have I Been Trained? And basically it's like a search engine into Common Crawl. So, you know, Tara, we talked about having fun with just the ChatGPT doing things like create a limerick about, you know, Rebecca Harold, and that was kind of fun. But now it's like, oh, I'm going to go in here and use this Have I Been Trained to see what I could find out there. I'm worried about information of victims since I've done cases for victims. The first thing I checked on was rape victims. I entered that in there. Oh my gosh, I found returned from that horribly disturbing explicit photos. This is data that's being used to train ChatGPT, right? So we have all of this these images, these descriptions. I also looked at rape victim police file. The actual police files were coming up with the details, with names, with ages, with the types of assault, assaults on them, injuries. So as I'm seeing this, I'm thinking, wait a second, this isn't publicly available, or it shouldn't be. So this is telling me that, is this coming from breached data that has been made available somewhere, possibly on the, on the dark web, but maybe it's coming from other places, or maybe was this found in an unsecured area where it was stored in a cloud server, and the actual tool was able to go into those cloud systems that were not sufficiently secured and collect data from areas that most people had expected or thought were secured. So anyway, that's just a simple example of finding things that I'm thinking to myself then, okay, they're victims, their information is out there. What happens when people find it again? Like I found it. Who knows this? I'm not the only one that knows that type of data is out there. That people who want to use those tools are using them for a malicious purpose, right? To do bad things, in addition to all the people who are using it to do good things. And I think too many people who are really excited about ChatGPT and just really are fans of it, which there's a lot to be fans for. I've looked at the writing and all that, and and other things, but you always have to remember that, again, these tools, for as great of benefits that they bring, they also can bring great threats if you don't have them secured. I used patient file. I entered patient file. I found thousands of actual patient files that look like were especially paper files that had been scanned from all over the world. This is from all over the world. And I could tell just simply because of addresses, because of the languages and so on. So when you're thinking about the source of the data that you're using, then look at the fact that all of this, that's very sensitive personal data. Those folks haven't given their consent to use it. But now think about all the misinformation that's out there. Think about all of the the deep fakes and everything else that's taking and making people look like they're saying something that they really didn't say, and that they did something that they really didn't do. And all of that is being used, and it's being used and being incorporated into business decisions. It's being used to make decisions about not only business, but hiring, firing, about mortgages, about, loans. So I guess I'll stop there, and perhaps you have some feedback, but it was just alarming. I spent so much time just looking at, and I could go on and on and on about all the things that I found that I know the folks whose information that it was, it applied to, they would not want to have a tool like this with using their data without their consent. I mean, a question for you and Richard is, how is this in compliance with the existing data protection laws and regulations throughout the world? In the US, we have HIPAA. I saw all these medical files, a lot of them from US hospitals, but I also saw some from the UK and other places. But I'm thinking that would be a HIPAA breach right there. I mean, so just those issues alone, and I haven't even touched on all of the security issues, but just those few privacy issues alone make me want to really dig into it deeper and see, what more are they using to train this tool?
The lack of transparency on the where the data comes from is an issue. Even the terms of use and the privacy notice are not appearing on when you actually want to subscribe to an account. I personally always use a fake name, and I even got a fake email phone number. Sorry, this is how I joined the GPT. Otherwise, other people usually give their own name and their phone number, and whichever research they do would be associated to this name and this phone number. So this is an issue, and they don't have any transparency. And this is a very important GDPR requirement. They cannot give consent without knowing what they are consenting for. So that's another problem. The data minimization is a problem because there's a huge mass of data that's been collected. And then what happens if you find things about you that you want to disappear? The right to be forgotten is completely absent. I'm not even sure from a technical point of view how it's possible. I read a very interesting article that I've shared that seemed to say this is out of my technical capabilities, but apparently even updating the database is a nightmare. It's such
in fact, technically, Tara, with these neural network models, whether it's a language model or any other neural network model, images or anything else, it is technically infeasible to delete anything without killing the AI or the model and reteaching it, having cleaned up the database. There is no known mechanism for removing all of those weightings that lead you back to the data that you want to try and delete. It just isn't feasible. And the way, if you look at the foundation of these large language models, they aren't actually recording knowledge in a way that we humans call it knowledge. All that the LLM, the GPT-3, not the ChatGPT-3, which is the generative stuff, but the GPT-3 language model has no inherent knowledge. All it has is the probabilities that a token is related in some fashion to lots of other tokens in probability. Very small probabilities here, there, and everywhere, but it has no technical, formal concept of knowledge. It's the generative that is supposed to create the topic following capability to follow a prompt. So what it does, it looks at tokens, which might be a token, might be a word or part of a word, and it's also, okay, these are tokens, the sequence of tokens in the prompt. Now, what's the next token I need to add to the list? And it will look at all the probabilities in these billions of parameters and say, oh, I think I'll take this token. And then it does a next cycle to say, oh, I've got this set of tokens now, which includes the one I just added. Now what should come next? And it's, as Meg Mitchell and Timnit Gebru from Google, the leading ethicists until they were fired, they call them stochastic parrots. They have no knowledge. They're just rabbiting on or parroting on based purely on statistics. And just occasionally, the statistics happen to collate or to correlate with what we're calling knowledge. It's an accident, almost as an accidental capability that it actually fantasizes the truth.
And once the fantasy is out there, it's very difficult to get it back. And I've actually seen ways that you could manipulate what it's saying. It asks you feedbacks. So with the feedbacks, you could feed him back with some other fake information. And because it's always is mixed up with some part that are real knowledge, real information, and some part are not at all and complete hallucination. For someone who is not going further and pushing to check, and there is no source to check what is saying, it's a machine of misinformation from what I've seen.
Completely. And in fact, at the moment, ChatGPT from OpenAI is not actually learning anything. You can feed stuff in today or yesterday, and it doesn't know about it today because they haven't got it built into learning. Whereas Bing Chat may well have some capability to re-ingest itself. I'm not entirely sure of that one yet. But it's basically working only off the data or the token probabilities that it was trained on up to the end of, what's it, 2021, I think, or I think it's end of 2021. Now, if we're looking at the question of, the sources of data, as Rebecca said, we know exactly where the sources are of the data that has been used, the text. open crawl, common crawl, and then there's big lists of the types of sources of books and a few academic articles, about 4 or 5%, I think, and so on and so forth. From that perspective, we know where the data comes from conceptually. The common crawl stuff is a bit more difficult because we can actually go and kind of get an understanding of where everything is, which is why, and it's actually there's a whole archive of common crawl being built up on GitHub. And so you can go there and you can get the common crawl for each month back as to 2000 and whenever it was, 7. And you can interrogate it, and there's tools in GitHub in that common crawl package, which allows you to open up all of the tar files or GZ files or whatever. And so you can do the sort of tasks that Rebecca's talking about. But that has the problems that we've been discussing as well, about the question of copyright and so on. It gets more interesting when you go across to the other generative technologies in images, where it's very much more obvious that these images were grabbed without licensing, without any agreements. And it's, to me, highly amusing that as they're all being threatened with massive copyright cases around, certainly in America, and I guess probably in this country as well, they are rushing, like tripping over themselves to come to licensing agreements with all and sundry to provide sort of small fees and so on. But in the text world, because of the probabilistic nature of the generative technology, it's going to be much more interesting to understand how the question of intellectual property and copyright and so on is going to be handled. I can see it easily in multimedia, in music, and in and lyrics for songs, and in terms of images. But because of the way that the language models have been created on this probabilistic basis for a token, a word or part word level, I suspect it's going to be much, much more difficult to prove copyright theft unless you actually get it, absolutely verbatim.
We have seen universities banning. We have seen, it was a university in France that had been complaining that more than 50% of the students had done plagiarism. As someone who is at the University of Derby, how do you see that the educational system should adapt to ChatGPT, and how they could understand and make the student understand what the value and the evaluation of such a tool could be?
That's an interesting one. I mean, I've been looking at this one. It actually goes back. There's also a question in the chat from, where is it? Sorry, keep going. Eric Atwell's pointed out, he's interested in understanding the use of ChatGPT in education, assessment, and so on for AI MSCs. And I've been discussing that on LinkedIn, and also discussing with some of my colleagues, that particularly in the context of the fact that we're hearing stories that, oh, ChatGPT is clever enough to pass the Wharton Business School MBA, or that it can pass a medical exam. And with the work I have done, and looking at the sort of questions that I set my own students at undergraduate and master's level, the fact that it can pass the Wharton MBA tells me far more about the trivial nature of the questions that are set for the Wharton MBA students that can be answered straight out of the textbook. Mm-hmm. It tells you more about the type of questions which are set for medical students, and you can understand it. If you're asking students about physiology and so on, and you're asking about, I don't know, the kidneys or something, there is a right answer, and you'll find it in the textbooks. And so that these probabilities, it's not Markov chains or anything like that. This is much more associated to the parameters, by the way, to someone who's just been mentioning it, in a huge billion element multivariate analysis type of thing. So it's not Markov at all. And the thing that's interesting is it can somehow, and I don't quite understand quite why it can do this, but it can actually quote directly, maybe because the probabilities are so high for certain types of chains of tokens, so that it can pass these. And you look at a typical business school lecturer, and I've been part of the UK Derby Business School for some years, or was for a while. They love the textbook publishers like Pearson and so on, who say, would you like us to produce you the textbook for your module? Oh, and by the way, we suggest you create it as 12 chapters. And you think, 12 chapters? Oh yes, of course, that's one chapter for each week of the semester. And they create it, particularly in the business school area. These are the answers about this, about this, about this. And they're all out there on the internet. So it's ever so simple. If you provide a simplistic answer to a business school student, essentially you are asking them to regurgitate their knowledge. You aren't asking them to do a series of critical evaluations and justifications, at which point, as I've proven today twice, and I asked ChatGPT, please give me or tell me some frameworks which will be useful to evaluate the ethics, trust, and governance issues relating to the use of large language models. And every time I ask that, it comes up with 5 frameworks, sets of questions, and it hallucinates all 5 of them. Not one of the ones I've had actually exists. And this leads me to an interesting conclusion, and I think one of the people I've been discussing that with Tara and Rebecca this afternoon is in the audience. And we were sort of talking around about how it's impacting on assessment, or because it can answer exam questions so easily because they're so trivial. We said, well, actually, it's going to force people to change the way they handle assessment, or even at sixth form level, perhaps, because what it's going to do is will change the approach in these sort of areas to, okay, here, students, go and get ChatGPT to give you 1,000 words on this topic. And then the assessment is not about that. The assessment is about the skills you are developing in terms of research, critical thinking, critical analysis, synthesis of good ideas from evidence, finding multiple sources, and using that as your assessment. And you won't be able to get these LLMs to actually do that because they don't understand concepts. They don't understand semantics and meaning and grammar. They just happen to have some patterns that they've learned which kind of generate this stuff. And this is the way we will actually be developing useful citizens, useful graduates, because they can actually understand these things and they can do the interesting stuff which we really want them to do, which is to go left field and find ideas way out over there that do connect with the topic and come up with something really interesting. Now that's a superstar A grade or distinction. And most of the AIs we've been having over the last 10, 15 years will mark those sort of amazingly good assignments as absolutely rubbish because they can't see this connection from left field and right field. They can't do the synthesis which we academics are looking for. We want these novel ideas.
Isn't it
and
not?
there is no way that it's going to do that.
The school system has used to have students as a passive listener, that their brain was fed with information and they had to go home, learn it by heart, come back to school, repeat, just like a parrot. I'm myself a self-learner, so I even did my baccalaureate self-candidate, and I did all my masters and everything by hardly putting my fingers at university. I prefer to work on my own rhythm. But with all the tools available, I think this is where education should go. We should not feed the kids, would it be the younger ones or at uni, but tell them these are the information that we need to process. go and find the source, go and check the source and judge the value of your source, make the sentences, and come back and repeat that and present that to your peers. It's probably the best way of doing it. And even though they go to ChatGPT, I saw on the one of the question we had was one student saying some of his peers are just going to copy and rephrase what ChatGPT says. But if the assessment is come and repeat what you have read, that's easy to do. But if the assessment says, come and tell me where you find your information, how you decided this information was valuable, and make the sentences and present it orally to your peers, then even though he copied it from ChatGPT, the part was correct, well, good for him.
Yeah, the thing that then happens, and this is both to the student who happens to be one of my students, I think, is that when you get into the turning ChatGPT's rather bland stuff with one or two fantasy citations or references in it, by the time you have actually started checking it, you have spent more time doing that than actually doing the job from first principles. I mean, just looking at those frameworks, it takes me possibly half an hour to an hour just to validate what elements of those 5 frameworks actually relate to anything that's true. And so by the time, and it doesn't know how to do citations properly, it kind of gets it slightly, and it doesn't know the difference between a citation and a reference. You know, the reference is a long thing at the end, or in the footnotes if it's in a law article. And it doesn't really know how to do citations correctly. It fantasizes all of those with wonderful and beautiful capability. And so the reality is going to be that if student writes or gets GPT to do something like that, it will be so obvious. It won't come up in a plagiarism check. They can put in to Turnitin and it will never be found as plagiarism, but it will fail because it doesn't meet the basic criteria for critical thinking, multiple perspectives, and all sorts of other things. And given that my assignment specification is typically 5 or 6 pages, that eats up most of the tokens you've got to start with. And there's an awful lot that's buried in there that added also in the verbal explanation that isn't in the written one, that will make it impossible for any of my students to be able to use ChatGPT to actually even pass. It doesn't have the ability to put 3 or 4 citations per paragraph. So from the perspective of education, I think that I have no concerns at all at the moment because of the nature of the types of questions. And I think that as we develop within academia, at the university, we've got some work going on. We're going to find that by changing the way that we set the assignment, I remember when I did my LLM quite a few years ago, one of my modules just had a list of 40 titles. And if you fed one of those titles in to something like ChatGPT, it would produce you, okay, not cited and references adequately, but it provide you with a sort of fairly bland story about the what was it then? Yeah, the wars in Yugoslavia. But what I'm doing today and what I'm encouraging my colleagues to do is to think much more carefully about type of assessment. Is it a really complex, identify frameworks, justify them, apply them to find out what the issues are, and then reapply them to solve the issues raised? That sort of conceptual critical thinking, critical analysis, and cycling through, it will not be able to do it. There is no fundamental theoretical, mathematical reason why it should be able to do it.
I'm reading on the chat conversations about skills that are needed in the future are critical thinking. This is something maybe that hasn't been enough emphasized so far. In the system where you had to do what you're told, probably something that also the assessment has to take account on teaching and encouraging more critical thinking. Rebecca,
looking at,
sorry, go
sorry.
ahead.
I was just going to answer Mr. Williams or Miss Williams, E. Williams. Critical thinking is a transferable skill because it's a process you apply. Yes, domain knowledge is incredibly important. You are right. But the actual process of critical thinking can be taught separately within a context as a means of applying it and learning it. But you can then use it in all sorts of areas. So I kind of disagree with you there, whoever that is. But anyway, I think, Rebecca, you're about to answer. Sorry.
Well,
Yeah. How can you see can you see, having looked at the data set behind ChatGPT, would you see any option for a better kind of equivalent of ChatGPT that would be a bit more scientific, more trustworthy?
well, actually, I would like to take a step even back further before we even get to the source data. So what I've been doing throughout my career and even through education, we're talking about critical thinking. My master's degree project was I created a critical thinking program for high school students to use on one of those really old Macintosh computers, but I got a really good grade on it, so they liked it a lot. But anyway, I agree with that, transferable. But let's go to that programming. Here's what I want to know. I want to know who has validated the algorithms that are running these tools, who validated that they are producing accurate results. And you should not have, another thing that I mentioned was the first thing I created back in my corporate career was creating a change control system. I can tell you when people want to validate what they created themselves, they're going to miss problems because just it's their baby, right? You aren't going to call your baby ugly because you created it. And it's the same way when you're creating software, when you're creating tools, you need to have objective evaluation and validation that these tools are producing accurate results. And right now, quite frankly, I have not seen where this has been done. Now, the vendors will come back and say, oh, well, that's intellectual property. We can't make it open source. Don't make it open source then. There's a lot of people out there. Shoot, I've done this for organizations my whole career is I review their engineering plans and how they are going to do these things. And that's where you find the problems in the planning and then in the actual programming itself. So I think what would help and needs to be done sooner rather than later, because if we continue to use something that's not actually even giving accurate results, then we're going to just keep snowballing that problem and it's never going to get corrected. We need to correct it now. So we need to know how we validate that algorithms that we're using for these purposes are getting accurate results. Who's validating them? What kind of proof do we need to have that can be used if somebody wanted to audit that? And that way, then it will make it easier. It will make it more possible to have the tool actually come back and say, we don't want to use this in our training database because we've been programmed to be smart enough to be able to tell that this data is not good data that should be used to train us. That's what we need to do. And right now, it seems to me like with all of the problems that we're having, certainly we've already gone over the problems with having the source data containing, incorrect information to begin with, personal data of individuals who haven't consented. But, we need to look at how we're going to make sure that the tool can actually identify those issues before it actually allows that data to be used in the training of those tools. And from an engineering viewpoint, it can be done. I think, though, to date, there's no laws requiring that. There's no appetite there to put in the time and the resources to engineer that into the solution. But we need to do that just as if you're creating something that's impacting people's lives and safety and harming them in any number of ways beyond just, your school papers and so on, I think we need to make sure that they're engineered in a very proper manner that's something that can be auditable.
Well, it goes back to general principle of the GDPR, and one of them being data accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
Cannot deal with the data that is not accurate. And you have to do data minimization, which is, as you're saying, if we make the data more accurate and if we minimize the data, we have a smaller data set, but then there would be a higher quality data that can actually lead to something that worth something. Because currently a GPT telling 20% true and 80% hallucinating is a lot of energy consumption. And that also has some impact on the environment. So it's not sustainable. But it's kind of what I like to call the Google hype, where the whole thing was collect as much data as you can, create a big data set and see what you can do with it, which is going to end up by being something that is not a good quality. And that's why I like GDPR, because it goes back to the principle of good practice, minimize the data, check the accuracy of the data, allow the delete of the data, because there are cases where people genuinely need to have the data not appearing on a machine. And as you mentioned at the beginning, there are some health data that should not be there. And keeping the data secure is another thing. Is having a big data set and a lot of personal data included put all the data at risk.
I mean, coming back to both of those the questions about validation and so on, I've spoken at quite a few of the UK software testing conferences over the last 4 or 5 years. And for the last 3 or 4 years, the major point has been that testing are, let's call them AI systems, whether it's language models or many of the other AI type systems, is a completely different task from the traditional software testing and validation environment, where we have traditionally, with our old algorithmic systems, traditional IT systems, we have a fairly well developed, fairly accurate requirement specification, which in principle ends up with metacode, which is then translated by a human into code, programming code and so on. And then the software test engineers take that and develop their testing harnesses and so on to prove the software does what the specification said. Now, with all of the modern neural networky types of systems in particular, but also predictive analytics type regression analysis and logistic regression systems, we can validate that the code works as it should do according to the spec, which says what the if then else logic has to be. What we cannot do very easily with the traditional software testing approaches is to say, okay, now that when I'm training it, I just throw enormous amounts of data at this pattern finding technology, and there's different types of pattern finding technology. We then find out what patterns it's found, which is correlation, essentially, for many of those, not for the LLM, but for many of the other ones. And we then have to use very different techniques to prove that in this particular case, and as the UK ICO tells us or suggests, it could be through auditing, it could be through visualization, we can get some degree of confidence that it's doing the right thing in any particular case, because we cannot in any specific case actually interrogate the inside of the machine to understand how it made the decision. Now, looking at the LLMs and ChatGPT things, we have to dissociate the whole beastie into 2 completely separate parts. There is a language model, GPT-3 or GPT-4, which is that probabilistic model of how tokens follow tokens or relate to tokens, which in our terms is how words relate to words in probabilistic terms. It's just a gigantic vector space of probabilities of connectability. The outputs are, and that it just does what it does. We can prove with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 examples, or even with GPT-2, as Stephen Wolfram points out, we can kind of understand GPT-2 on our own PC. We've got a big, powerful one. And you can see how it does it. And you can kind of work out that, yeah, it's putting the words or developing the vectors that represent words in the right sort of places with the right sort of relationships. But that doesn't tell us anything about its knowledge. It just tells us that it's turned this body of words, which are massive examples of how sentences work and how words follow words within sentences. And that's all it is. The generative stuff, which then sort of depends how you look at it, sits on top or is fed from all of this, is the bit that is very interesting, because again, we can validate that each neural network algorithm does what it's designed to do as an individual standalone. We can validate that against a spec because there's a spec for the if then else type of logic. When we put them together in layers and layers and layers, the 12 layers in GPT-2 that based generative, or ChatGPT-3, which I think has 24 layers in the generative mechanism, which is calculating from this enormous 175 billion parameters that it has to go through every time, and calculates what the next token is. At that point, it becomes remarkably difficult to understand why it's doing what it does, because we can't understand 175 billion parameters in relation to the question I've put here. So we can't prove that it will or will not plagiarize. We can't prove or disprove whether it is or is not pulling large chunks out of those documents it was trained on. It's technically infeasible. And coming back to GDPR, we can't remove the impact of this body of medical data that shouldn't be there in the common crawl. We can't delete the impact on the weighting factors of the personally identifiable information that's accidentally been put in there. We cannot remove that because of the way that the epochs and training, batching size and so on, we can't do that.
Because it's been using a very large database. What if the LLM was using a smaller database where we knew?
Can I make a point about that first, though, Tara, if I may?
Please go ahead.
Because, so with testing, so definitely you have to test to ensure that it is that the software is doing what is it intended to do. However, throughout all my years, I have continually seen that the next step never gets done. And that's where the next step needs to be done, of course, with these types of AI tools. But that next step is to do quality assurance testing, not just for intended outcomes, but you also have to test at parameters that are outside of what is expected, such as for medical types of data. And you can actually, from a programming, a technical standpoint, there are certain things you can put into your test data that you can actually make sure that when things are coming into the program to be analyzed, that if it is falling outside of the expected parameters, you can't just test for expected parameters to work correctly. You have to ensure that you're also testing for all these unexpected parameters to test correctly. And that's where automated testing of software comes in, is very valuable, because you're right. I mean, it would be almost impossible to try to do this, manually, but with automated testing, you can actually take AI now testing to run against the AI tools, but the programmers have to make sure that, is it doing what we want it to do, and answer that question, but go beyond that and say, well, is it going to do what we want it to do when we have something that's not acceptable coming into it here, or something that's going on that's unacceptable here? Maybe there was something that got changed in the algorithm. And that's another thing, because these algorithms, of course, are often self-changing, or they're being changed by programmers. that needs to be something that these tools need to be smart enough to identify if a change was made, and then to give the correct notice to those who are managing or overseeing the use of those tools, so that they can then come in, and that's where they need to use their human critical thinking skills to say, you know, this does look weird over here. Maybe we better check on this. So I think we're at such a nascent point in the development of AI that the possibilities are just wide open for what we should be doing. But that's why it's so important to get on the right track now, so we don't go way off in the wrong direction and end up with so many more problems than what we had to. Just look what happened with, you know, PCs and malware, all the different types of malware we have now. If we would have known back then and tested more back then for what could have been possible, maybe we could have prevented a lot of the problems that we have now.
I mean, it comes back to a couple of things you bring to mind. One is that we tend to think about the sort of data-driven decision-making of the world, whether it's with AI or any other predictive analytics. But we need to remember, as John Easton from IBM said in 2012, 80% or more of all of the data we have in all of our systems, including our corporate systems, is of uncertain veracity, which is why so many big data analytics projects spend 80% of their budget on cleaning up the data and loading it before they get around to building the shiny stuff. So we must remember that in all that we're doing. The other side of the coin, and looking at some of these questions here, is reminding me just why we would, or anybody, given that we now know, we're seeing that at least about 80% of everything that ChatGPT is producing seems to be hallucination or dreams or lies, depending on your whatever term you want to use. Would any of the audience, as professional in the field of computing and IT, would any of you be allowed to release a new product that you project managed if it was producing 80% false, incorrect answers? And I think the answer from every one of us here, all 75 of us who are currently present, would be, we would never dream of releasing our products with error rates that high. Because that shows it's not meeting the requirements of our system. And we could kind of say the requirement spec for ChatGPT is that used a large language model of probabilities to show how words relate to each other in the English language and one or two other languages. And we want to be able to answer questions accurately. And 80% falsehood is clearly not adequate. And as the three of us here, I think today, have been looking at our own, you know, tell me about myself, tell me about Richard Self, tell me about Tara Taubman-Basirian, tell me about Rebecca Herold. Not one, I mean, there's virtually no facts in any of those responses that are actually factually correct. In the efforts that I've had today, there are only two facts which are correct. One, that I was a member or have been a member of the BCS, only got it slightly wrong, I was a fellow, which I'm not. And that I am a fellow of the higher education, in the HEA in the UK. Every other detail was incorrect, which is sort of 99.999% error rates. Now that is actually grossly negligent to release such a tool into the public.
I have one thing that comes to my mind is we have all been looking at the tool as something capable of receiving and understanding question and providing an answer. It's actually not the tool that it is. It's been wrongly launched. It's only what someone says. It's an extension of Grammarly. What he knows to do is to write something with the correct syntax. And this is why originally, when I started the discussion, I mentioned my difficulties with being French speakers, and you two being UK English and US English, is this difficulty for the global world to speak a standard English. And what GPT can do is bringing that assistant help just to write, but in which case, it's a lot of energy consumption. It's a lot of other issues only to be an extension of Grammarly and giving you correct sentences. You agree with me?
Yeah, I do agree about the extraordinary costs, and the Bing ChatGPT is going to cost even more per answer, because it's not only got to use Bing search, is then ChatGPT has then got to sort of read all of the answers, all of the links, and come up with an answer, and that's going to be even more extraordinary. But to answer Eric's point, Eric Atwell, you're saying it's only high error rates if you try to catch up. No, I'm not. If I'm looking up, you know, any student might well want to find out the details of a person in history, or a person that, you know, that they've met, and we now are discovering that it does not do CVs accurately. It hallucinates almost completely. Why are students using it? Because they don't yet know otherwise. They haven't actually started asking questions. My daughter was asking ChatGPT a couple of nights ago a question about what a very famous Mexican artist. And it came back with a very plausible, persuasive answer, except it got the date of her husband's death wrong. It said that he died after her, when in actual fact, he died before her. And unless you know that, you will believe the answer. And this is the biggest problem we have. And this is why students all over the world, and lots of people are going following the hype. They don't have the expertise or the knowledge to actually contest it. And I mean, for example, on one of my posts on LinkedIn today, one of my followers, first level connection, said, this is what it said about me. Now, if I had got that answer about her, how would I know that it's right or wrong? Because I don't know her well. I don't know all the details. It said that my vice chancellor, when I asked it about my vice chancellor, it said she has worked in many universities in the UK and Australia. She's never been in a university in Australia, but it looks authoritative. It's persuasive. And yet it is wrong. And I'm actually going to be launching, discussing my head of department, one of my set of independent study dissertation topics for the our MSc Big Data Analytics students is going to be to try to evaluate the accuracy and in which context something like ChatGPT or Bing Chat is accurate. So we could begin to actually quantify how it's working. Because I have yet to find an answer from ChatGPT, not trying to catch it out. I'm not asking tricky questions. I'm just asking ordinary sorts of questions. And if I don't know the answer, because I don't have expertise in that answer, who knows? When I ask it about a piece of music, because I'm not a music expert, how do I know, and how long does it take me to track down whether it is or is not true? And that's why I'm telling my students, I don't care if you try to use it. If you don't edit it, I will immediately fail it, because what I will receive is so below standard, even for a first-year undergraduate, that you as a master's student will fail instantly. It doesn't have all the criteria. And to get that stuff into it, the critical thinking, the critical analysis, the multiple perspectives, the multiple citations per paragraph, and so on, go start from scratch and do it yourself. It's as simple as that. We don't know when it's wrong if we don't have the expertise. And that is its incredible danger.
And once something wrong has been reproduced in several papers and repeated by several other people, then it completely muddles up what is true and what is fake.
That will happen as they start ingesting in the future. They aren't doing it yet, but in the future they will be ingesting their own output. And that's going to be fearsome.
I think what makes it so persuasive is that it appears that they spent a lot of time making it so that it wrote grammatically correct content. It's well written when you look at the results, and that when people read something that's well written, I think that that's a psychological advantage for the tool. That's a social engineering type of thing, because when you look authoritative, when you sound authoritative, people are going to believe you. So the results of this, to both of your points before, yeah, it rewrites things so it reads, fabulously. I mean, I've had it rewrite some of my things. It's like, wow, this is nice how it rewrote a passage of text to make it more succinct and so on. But, to what you're talking about, it seems like they put all of their, or most of their effort into making the output look grammatically correct and well written, but they didn't spend as much time ensuring that it was accurate and was using valid input to train the tool on, and the other tools as well, to have something that was also valuable and, useful, that would not be misinformation or incorrect or, so on.
And the interesting thing, Rebecca, is that they didn't actually engineer in from first principles the ability to write good grammar. It just happens to have learned the patterns. They haven't put in anything from a scientific basis, from linguistics, about the structure of sentences, the way that verbs work, or the way that the nouns and adverbs and adjectives all work. None of that is built in. They haven't used any linguistic science in the whole way that GPT, the generative system, works. I think they've used a little bit of some aspects of linguistics in the tokenization process. But other than that, there's nothing in the system that knows anything about the structure. It just happens from the probabilities. And this is why I say that these learning systems are intellectually, the people who develop them are intellectually staggeringly lazy. They don't go to the scientific principles that underpin what's actually happening. They haven't used any sensible aspects of linguistic theory in terms of semantics or symbolic logic or the idea of relationship of concepts and so on. None of that, there's no logic built into it. It is just purely those probabilistic patterns. There's nothing else in there. And to me, it's actually quite interesting that it's able to produce this beautiful, grammatically, or mostly grammatically correct, persuasive language. And that's a really intriguing thing. They didn't build any logic in to make it do that. It just happened through the probability.
It just did it because it's a stochastic parrot.
Yes.
So by repeating, he repeated well.
Absolutely.
Well, grammar is a little bit more rules defined, though, than these other decisions, right? So that's why it probably learned that more quickly, and now is mirroring that in the results, as opposed to other things that they're concepts that most humans oftentimes can't figure out. So it's like, how are we going to get this algorithm? And from my background, I want to see those algorithms, and and I know that would take having a contract with an NDA executed to be able to see them. But I would love to have those evaluated by a third party, just to see what they say about them.
Yeah.
The certification is probably what is needed in general in the IT system, the whole, even on a building on a website, we need to have certification. So there should be someone, an institution that could check what is being done before being launched in a general public.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what could be done positively, I have seen one case where there was a artificial intelligence built to help medical diagnose, where I've seen the utility to be used in hospital, in especially A&E, places where they don't have much time, where the practitioner could enter the symptoms and then from some serious database that the machine would have, could have some ideas of different possible diagnose. Do you think that is something it's possible?
Interesting. And we go back, I think we need to go back to over the last 8 years or so, and to think about what happened with IBM's Watson cognitive engine. And after having won Jeopardy, they then thought, what should we do with it that's useful? And they tried to develop Watson Oncology, a machine that was fed with 750,000 academic papers and research papers about how to identify and then treat a small number of types of cancer. And they thought that they could capture all the expertise of the oncology experts in the Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital, one of the leading hospitals in oncology in the States. What surprised them was, because this machine doesn't work with neural networks, it works with different technologies, and it could actually demonstrate, trace its decision-making process and probabilities and so on, but not at an LLM basis. And they discovered that it would not work in any other hospital in the world because of the uniqueness of access to technologies, to diagnostic technologies, to treatment technologies, etc., etc., etc. What IBM did after that was then to spend more than a small fortune acquiring a whole range of medical diagnostic AI companies, startups and so on, over the next 4 or 5, 6 years. And what is interesting was that around about the week of the 18th of October 2018, this was the week that they announced they'd spent $40 billion buying Red Hat Linux, because that was their future. But in the small print, you suddenly discovered that they were essentially going to retreat from the Watson medical diagnostics division. And it's now on the market for less than $1 billion. And I don't know whether you've heard, Rebecca, whether someone's bought it yet, but I don't think anybody's bothering. Now, if IBM has said, we cannot get this type of medical diagnostic approach working with AI, then if we are going to go for neural networks, many areas it won't work. It does work reasonably well in terms of image analysis, so scans and MRI scans and so on. It seems to be quite good. It's also bizarre at times. There was a report, an academic report, of how, as part of a research project to identify the sort of things that these neural network image analysis systems can come up with, they asked, was there any way of connecting? Well, no, they didn't. They just said, here are the images, and oh, by the way, they're tagged with ethnicity. You remember that one, Rebecca?
I remember. I don't know the details of it, but I remember.
What came out of it was that for reasons humans have absolutely no idea about how it does it, it was pretty accurate at attaching ethnicity to the scans.
Yes, yes.
With a test set. They were wanting to identify the fact that if we release this sort of medical diagnostic system, it will find new patterns which possibly relate to protected characteristics, gender, etc., 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 or ethnicity. Now, what was even more bizarre is they were able to resolution the images down to 10%, and it still was able, when you could hardly, a human would look at it and say, that's hardly an X-ray. Mm-hmm. Now, these are where it gets very, very interesting and potentially extremely dangerous in terms of protecting, because, you know, half the time it doesn't matter what the ethnicity of a patient is, but there are times when it's vitally important. Now, if we've got someone from Nigeria or West Africa, it's kind of useful to know that they are ethnically from there, because then you might change your diagnosis from something to thalassemia or to sickle cell anemia, whatever. So there are times when it's necessary and times when it's not. And so my gut feel is that there are a small number of areas where we are doing image analysis and where we have instrument measured parameters that diagnostics probably are not too bad, but we have to remember, and some of you are probably experts in this area in terms of the so-called confusion matrix of false positives, false negatives, true positive, true negative. If the data, and those are set up and work if you have nicely balanced data. But if you have typical medical data, which is, say you're looking for, I don't know, sepsis, you probably have between 1% and 5% or less of true positives in the whole sample. And you've got 95% plus who are the true negatives. Now, your confusion matrix based accuracy parameter gets blown away by that, because even if it's only 80% accurate on the true positives, that can hide beautifully the fact that it is 80% inaccurate on identifying true positives. In other words, it's only finding 20% of the true positives. And you have to be very careful about your measures of accuracy. And that's going to be one of the interesting, fun parts of teaching my students, is when you're looking at the accuracy of, say, ChatGPT, don't go near the confusion matrix parameters. It'll lead you up the gum tree. You've got to find a different way of measuring accuracy or success.
Yeah, I think that what complicates it too is that you have to consider context for most of these situations that we're talking about. And how do you how do you do that? Data has a lot to do with it. Algorithm has a lot to do with it. But like you were just, talking about, when the data is biased, then the outcomes are going to be, or results are going to be inaccurate, because it didn't include, everyone in the population who has different reactions to different types of situations, and physical differences and so on. So yeah.
Yeah, you're so right. And the thing is that a lot of medical diagnostics, from things like blood samples, etc., even if you have the whole population, you have a tiny little signal of true positives in there, swamped by vast numbers. And even if you take hospital visits, you're doing a blood test for some sort of virus or bacterium. Again, most of the tests you expect to come back negative, and you're looking for a very small signal of the true positives. And what you need to be thinking about is not the accuracy parameter. You actually need to think about, as you said, the actual contextual implications. If I miss say 10% or 15% of true positives, that has serious consequences, possibly death, for those patients. The false negatives, well, they're a bit of an irritation to the expert who is actually then making the decisions, because there's this chunk of false positives, which are a bit of a nuisance. And the false negatives. False positives are a problem for death. The false negatives are just an overload problem for the expert.
Richard, I have to interrupt you because we are coming to the end of the session. We've been having a very engaging audience, lots of interesting questions. Unfortunately, we can't answer everything, but I'm inviting maybe Rebecca, if you want to choose one question to answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you. There was one that was early on in our discussion, and it was from Antonio, I think, Antonio Hidalgo Landa. It was about, oh, that's legal tech. No, this was from Emmanuel. Can there be legislation framework to audit AI projects to check for compliance with GDPR and other privacy compliance? So I love this question. I think we do need to have frameworks. And I do want to point out, of course, as I mentioned, I've been doing work for NIST for many years. They just released a few weeks ago on January 26th of this year, their artificial intelligence risk management framework. And then they also released at the same time their artificial intelligence risk management framework playbook and explainer video and a whole bunch of other things. Why I'm bringing that up with regard to compliance is these frameworks can often have the different parts of the framework mapped to the different requirements, right, of regulations. And so by mapping the requirements within different regulations such as GDPR, CCPA in the US, HIPAA, you know, all the hundreds of others that are out there, why that helps to at least provide a way to consistently do checks for compliance when you're trying to see if there are problems at a high level. It's not, I don't see them as being something that can give you, you know, minute, very detailed results, but they can be pointers to tell you, oh, there's a problem over here that maybe you need to look into a little bit more deeply. So I would say that's those are some good resources that you might want to look at that are written in a way that's maybe not, they're technical, but they don't get into, like, I'm also a member of IEEE, the Engineering Society, so they don't get into those types of nuts and bolts. So if you want to know them more at a higher level, I think they're very helpful for that.
I completely agree with that.
The EU is working on the AI Act, and there is also the Council of Europe working on a convention. So there are things are building, they are coming slowly.
And the AI harms directive or regulation as well, which is going to be very interesting, I think.
We had a few questions about copyright. It's an interesting question. Within what the OpenAI does, there is ChatGPT, but there is DALL-E, where they actually took a lot of artworks and reproduce artificial art. I would see more cases of copyright with DALL-E than with ChatGPT, simply because with ChatGPT, we don't know what the sources were and who they were copied. It came from online published documents, so it's going to be very difficult. Also because a lot of copyright cases, some artists go to court mainly because that's one way of making their name known by everyone. So my prediction is if there is a copyright suit, it would come from an artist.
Or a photographer.
Oh, yes, yeah. Any other question you would like to answer, Richard, before we close? We only got a few minutes before the end, unfortunately.
No, I think, oh, there was one, hang on, there's just one I saw a little bit back. Well, there's one from Karen about LLM development rise from a small select subgroup of R&D groups. Yeah, and I think I kind of agree with that, because, and the other thing is that they're typically young, and they got captured by the sort of field of statistics and pattern finding. And this is why I say that they're intellectually lazy, because they're not looking at the fundamentals of their topic, their domain areas. They're not looking at the fundamentals even of sort of medicine, in a sense. They just say, okay, here's lots of stuff about medicine and about diagnosis. Let's throw it at something that looks for patterns and then see what happens. And I think probably the biggest takeaway I will want to leave with everybody is that at the end of the day, there will be no copyright cases against the machine, because the machine does not have legal personality at the moment. even though some people are thinking that it'd be nice to be able to allow AI to have patents.
One case of the monkey taking a picture and a big copyright debate and knowing if the picture belonged to the monkey or to the photograph.
Yeah. And the reality is, if any harm happens, it ain't going to come back to the machine or the AI. It's going to come back to you who released it. So if ChatGPT creates a slanderous or libelous piece of material that you then publish, there is no going back and saying it's OpenAI or ChatGPT. You are the person who issued it. You will be done for libel. You will be done for the damages because you have made the decision to release it. You maybe were negligent in not checking it. And we know that so many people not actually checking the stuff and putting it out there.
I do publish a lot, and I publish on the Creative Commons. So I'm happy to release, I'm happy to be read, I'm happy to be copied as far as I'm cited. But when it's copied by an LLM, I'm not cited. That's where there is a tiny nuance. Stephen Castle was saying, as he was putting a question and was saying, can we have a definite agreement that legally no one has an IP or moral right in their personal image? That's the fundamental debate. Some people would say that actually copyright is far too long, 70 years after the death of the author, one thing. And second is copyright give a monopoly of the knowledge or the art, while the whole humanity would benefit if there was no copyright. But that's another big debate. We could speak for hours, but unfortunately, I think we are reaching the limit. We are 8:27, and I might give back the floor to our friend Panagiotta, who is going to give some announcement on future webinar by the BCS. I thank Rebecca and Richard for your contribution. It was very enriching, very interesting debate. We could speak for hours, but unfortunately we are limited by time. And thank you very much for our audience who's been very much engaging and asking questions. I invite everyone to contact any of us if they want to further the discussion or have other explanation or whatever is needed. Thank you very much, everyone. I said goodbye, and Panagiotta we're listening to you.
Thank you, Tara. We've captured all the questions and we will try to answer some of those also offline. I would like to thank Tara Taubman, Rebecca Herald, and Richard Self for their time and wonderful discussion.